we are live about 24 hours after news broke about the horrible shooting in Minneapolis. A lot of new developments. Most recently, the Minnesota Star Tribune has identified the ICE agent who shot Renee Good to death. His name is Jonathan Ross. And now that the shooter has been identified, one of the questions that is naturally going to come up is what happens next? We've seen just today reports that the U.S. Attorney's Office is freezing out state investigators. I'll get into the details of that. And we've also seen the deep scrutiny on the public domain videos that have been out there. And I just found it striking, as someone who's worked in a bunch of different newsrooms. This is the New York Times headline. Videos contradict Trump administration account of ICE shooting in Minneapolis. This isn't an editorial. This is a news story. And anyone who hasn't seen this New York Times video, see this video, because it takes a lot for a news organization to put a headline that definitive. The subtitle of that was an analysis of footage from 3 camera angles show that the vehicle appears to be turning away from the federal officer as he opened fire, and that the Washington Post reached the same conclusion. Again, visual forensics, their headline. Video shows ICE agent in Minneapolis fired at driver as vehicle veered past him. It doesn't get more definitive. As a news organization, make that decision to say, we can believe our own eyes. This is the footage that we're dissecting. Here with me today is Dave Aronberg. He's a former Florida State Attorney. You may know him as a Florida lawman. He is here on Substack as well. We're going to get into what happens next, because as these headlines and others indicate, there's a lot in the public record already. The various videos out there have been so scrutinized and dissected. And there is, from the serious news organizations that are picking this apart, they're arriving at some very definitive conclusions that really take a lot to get those words onto a headline. And Dave, before I turn to you, just one last point. There was also Bellingcat, another newsroom that dissected it. They reconstruct war zones to see what happened, to get at the origins based on public domain evidence. And the reason why I keep hitting this point, and this is where I turn it to you, Dave, is that it's quickly becoming very clear that the federal government is not going to cooperate with any investigation by state investigators, by state prosecutors. There's an AP headline to that effect. There is that the Minnesota Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension has said in a statement that the U.S. Attorney's Office is no longer cooperating. There's reporting as to that is coming from the directive of the U.S. Attorney in that jurisdiction. So what do you do, Dave, in a situation like this, where you have Donald Trump, Kristi Noem, J.D. Vance making statements smearing the victim of the shooting? Yeah. If this were an investigation that you're pursuing, that you think that the public domain evidence reaches a cold conclusion in your mind that this is a case worth pursuing, perhaps even a case worth charging, how do you operate? How do you proceed given this federal government deciding we are not going to include you in our investigation?
Yeah, Adam, thanks for having me, and thanks for plugging my own Substack, Dave Aronberg. I was state attorney for 12 years, and I investigated around 100 officer-involved shootings in those 12 years. I went to the scene of many of them myself. So this is an area I know a lot about. I've never been in a situation where the feds come in and purposely stymie a state investigation. Sometimes they'll come in and they'll say that we're interested in this, and then you defer to them and they're going to act in good faith. Here, the feds are coming in essentially to help ensure that this officer will not be charged. They can hurt a state investigation. They've already taken the materials. They're pretty much, they're not sharing it with the state, but the state can then begin its own investigation independently. It makes it harder, but they could do it. In fact, the state of Florida did it to spite the Biden administration after the second attempted assassination of Trump. This was the one at the Trump International Golf Course when DeSantis and his attorney general said, we don't trust the Biden administration. We're going to do our own parallel investigation. But in that case, the federal government had a good faith investigation and prosecuted the case themselves. So the state investigation was just for politics. Here, the state wants to do justice, and so they're going to have to do it independently. What you do is your own probe. You do your own interviews with civilian witnesses. You review all the Ring doorbell footage. You conduct your own forensic analysis of whatever the state has in its possession already. You also have the grand jury, which can issue subpoenas for certain types of evidence, although the feds will claim they have immunity, so they will not agree to testify before a state grand jury, federal officials. So you're limited. And then what the state can do is you can do a request. Essentially, you go to the courts because you have to first ask the feds to share. And the feds will say, no, we're not sharing. And then you go to court. And although the federal courts normally favor the federal agencies, a state can argue that withholding evidence prevents the state from fulfilling its own sovereign duty to investigate a homicide that occurred on its own soil. And the attorney general in Minnesota, Keith Ellison, has a lot of experience suing the federal government. So I think that is going to happen here.
So you talked about the witnesses, so that any kind of federal witnesses, they're not going to play ball. They're not going to send federal witnesses to a potential grand jury if one were convened. But there were a lot of witnesses that we've been watching on TV. We've been seeing witnesses quoted by a variety of different news organizations. You've talked about what the federal government can stymie from a state investigation. What avenues can they not control?
Well, I think it puts the defendant here, the cop, the ICE agent, at a disadvantage not to give his side of the story to state investigators. When the feds say, don't talk to them, we're not putting you in any situation, we're going to talk to state investigators, the state can still file charges based on probable cause. All they need is probable cause of a crime. Normally, prosecutors won't file unless they have a good faith belief they can get a conviction beyond a reasonable doubt. But when it comes to officer-involved shootings, that's an area where you employ the grand jury. At the state level, at least in Florida, I would think the same thing in Minnesota, you can just charge yourself. You don't need a grand jury. But when it comes to officer-involved shootings, you employ the grand jury sort of to vet the case because these are really politically charged cases and they're hard to prove. Generally, the public doesn't like to convict cops. So you vet it through a grand jury. This is a case that should go to a grand jury. If I were state attorney, I would bring this to a grand jury. Normally, you just close it out because the evidence shows there was no crime here. But here, there's enough evidence just by the video. You don't need to talk to the federal agent. You can just talk to the witnesses who said, for example, that the driver of the car, the victim, Miss Good, was getting conflicting instructions. One officer was telling her, get out of the car. The other one was saying, get out of here. And so she got out of there. So that's all relevant. So that's why I think that it may do the agent a disservice not talking to state investigators because the state can still prosecute the case even without the federal government's involvement.
Now, a lot of folks I see in the chat right now are talking about, they want to know a little bit more about Jonathan Ross. He's said to be an experienced ICE agent. According to the Star Tribune, he was dragged in a separate incident last year by a fleeing driver that was a matter that was wrapped up in court. And so the Star Tribune looked at those records. And there are various other news organizations that identify the ICE officer as Jonathan Ross. So that point you just made, Dave, about how this could be a disservice to him because there's plenty in the public domain that he has to answer for. Let's say Minnesota state prosecutors believe there's enough, and there's enough for a grand jury, and you know what? There's enough for an indictment.
Yeah.
If a grand jury reaches that determination.
Good.
So what happens? What happens once this case is charged in state court? He's a federal officer.
Immediately, the officer will try to get removed to federal court, and he will, because he's a federal official. He'll go to federal court. And the reason why they want it removed to federal court is because they want a federal judge who is not elected by the local community, who gets appointed for life, and they want it in that appellate circuit. That appellate circuit where Minnesota feeds into is generally considered a conservative one. And then at the top of that food chain is the U.S. Supreme Court, 6-3 conservative majority. So they want to get into federal court. They also want to make sure that the jury pool, because it's in federal court, will take in people from all parts of the state, which it will, which are more conservative areas, rather than a local state court, which is just in that blue county. So there are advantages to going to federal court. And they will also move to dismiss the case based on federal immunity. And the judge will be the federal judge who will make that decision whether it applies. The state will say, you don't automatically get immunity to do whatever you want. It's not a get out of jail free card. They're going to show that the agent acted with malice or outside the scope of his federal duty, that his actions were egregious or unwarranted. They're going to show that the agent was not in imminent danger and violated the DOJ and Department of Homeland Security manuals that say you're not supposed to stand in front of a car and create the situation that led to this shooting. So I think that the state actually has a claim that could prevail in state court, and you could see this being tied up for a while. But for those who think this is easy, it's going to go to federal court. The feds will give him immunity. And if that doesn't work, Trump will pardon him. Nope. Even if it goes into federal court, it's still a state prosecution, state charges, state prosecutors, and it's pardon proof because it's not a federal crime.
And to that point, even though it's going to federal court, the state prosecutors are they would be bringing this hypothetical case. And once the defendant here, if the case is charged, seeks removal, that happens automatically, correct? It just goes to federal court before the issues that you talked about are litigated?
Yeah, the state can try to fight it, but there's no sense in fighting it. He's a federal official. It's going to go to federal court. They're going to remove it. And, they remember during the state prosecutions of Trump, Trump's people, they tried to get removed to federal court. Remember but they were not acting in the scope of their job. Now you could say, well, he acted without the scope, but he was an ICE official at that time. So I think almost certainly it's going to be removed to federal court, but it'll still be state prosecutors and it will still be state law. And it just is a benefit in other ways for the for the defendant. Like I said, you have a more conservative jury pool. You have a judge who's a lifetime appointee. I just don't see this remaining in state court.
And if it's in federal court, that also means no cameras in the courtroom.
Yeah.
So let's go deeper into the first argument he's going to make in this hypothetical case. That would be the immunity. And you went into some of it. What gets into the arguments? We talk about the training, him stepping in front of the vehicle, this was not just one shot, and he might make arguments about the first one, but then there were other shots that went from the side of the car. What where do you see those arguments going?
I think that's crucial. Was he in reasonable fear of his life? You see some commentators said that it's what he thought at the time. No, it's not what he thought at the time. It's what he thought at the time through the prism of reasonableness. And it also matters if he created the risk. And it also matters if he had a chance to do something other than shoot, maybe step out of the way. That's why the DHS and the DOJ manuals say you're not supposed to stand in front of the car.
And
It's always tough to prosecute a law enforcement official. I know I saw some of the comments that said he's ICE, he's not a cop. They're going to cloak themselves as law enforcement, and law enforcement gets a lot of deference and a lot of credit and respect by juries. So this is not an easy case if it gets to a trial. But the best argument is that, I think, is that when you look at the videos, you see that the car was never intending to hit him. The car was moving out of the way. And so he was never in reasonable fear of his life. And even if you say, but look, the bullet went through the front of the windshield, so he was in front of the car, and he thought in his mind, especially because he was dragged in the past, that car was coming after him. Even if you allow him that, why did he shoot the second and third? And you and I are in disagreement whether there's a fourth shot. I'm not sure if there's a fourth shot, but the other shots were on the side of the car. And you can see by the videos, she was driving away. There's no reason to do those shots. That seems to be gratuitous.
And so we talked a little bit earlier about what the federal government can do to interfere with the state investigation. What about once it gets into the court? I mean, we do have, again, I said it a little earlier, you have Donald Trump, Kristi Noem declaring her immediately the victim, some sort of domestic terrorist or an agitator. We find out that that's a complete lie. But we have this extraordinary press conference from J.D. Vance and all of his attacking of the victim and celebrating of the shooter. We know where the federal government stands on this issue. They're all commenting on it. What happens once we have a charged case and it's in federal court? What can they do to try to muck up a state prosecution if Minnesota moves ahead?
They're going to try to keep the evidence themselves and not give the state any access. Then the state may have to go to court to get anything they need. But as far as shutting it down, really the only way they shut it down is for them to do their own case, for them to do their own prosecution. Then they would go first. That's how generally it works. But they're not going to prosecute this guy. They're going to protect him. And I do think the comments by Kristi Noem and J.D. Vance, it shows you the problem here. This is an administration that just wants confrontation. I mean, who are the people who are going to turn down the temperature? It just seems like everything is about trolling and owning the libs. And it's just, you just wish that there'd be some grownups. Ironically, I can't believe I'm saying this, but the one person who came out and made the appropriate statement was Homan, the head of DHS. Did you see his statement?
I did, and he later apologized.
He apologized for it?
In a sense. I don't. Let me be a little bit more careful in how I react to it. He said later on, in a sense, I said that before seeing more of the video. So it was a slight walk back once it became clear that what he was saying was, could have sounded like a rebuke to Kristi Noem and Donald Trump, because and for folks watching, what Tom Homan said in effect is we should wait for the investigation to proceed, which is something that is actually the responsible thing to do. I mean, that's that's what you're supposed
to say. That's what every elected official prior to this administration has said when there's a tragedy like this.
Yeah,
let the investigation continue. That's what I said as state attorney. You don't come out and say that's a domestic terrorist. That was terrible.
Right. I mean, you even had the mayor of Minneapolis giving a very strong statement in saying that ICE should, and this is a direct quote, get the fuck out of Minneapolis. But when push came to shove, he called the officer's actions reckless. He didn't name a statute because that's what someone in a position of power, they withhold judgment, they let the process play out. So, what do you know of the case law of the fight that's coming ahead if the state decides to prosecute? Because the officer is going to claim immunity. He is going to assert supremacy clause arguments, and there has been some litigation on this subject.
Yeah,
What do you think will happen?
there's a case from 1890 that gave federal officers a lot of deference and immunity. They said that a deputy U.S. Marshal who shot and killed a guy could not be charged with murder in state court because when he did so while acting as a bodyguard for a U.S. Supreme Court justice. But what's happened since then, just this last June, 2025, this Supreme Court handed down a case called Martin versus the United States, which held that 19th century case does not always protect federal officials who violate state law. In Minnesota, state law is a lot more pro-victim in this case because after George Floyd, they made their law different from the federal law, which protects law enforcement more so. That's why the state could base it on state law. But this Supreme Court case said that federal protection from that 19th century case does not always protect federal officials who violate state law. And the problem with this case that occurred in June is that it's a little vague. I need to read it over and over again because but the gist of the ruling is that a federal officer can only be protected with this immunity if they can demonstrate that their actions were necessary and proper in the discharge of their federal responsibility. So, of course, the state's going to say these were not necessary or proper. This was an execution. You were never in reasonable fear of your life. You are allowed, if you're a law enforcement officer, state or federal, and you have a significant fear that you or others are about to be killed or have serious bodily injury, then you can use lethal force. But that's not the case here. And again, even if you grant him the first shot, there were multiple shots, including shots when the car was not a threat to him at all, driving away. That's why the shots were on the side, not in the front.
Right, right. And obviously, you were former Florida state attorney. It's a different, if Minnesota prosecutors bring a case, would be under Minnesota law. But would you imagine that the charges would be around the, category of a homicide case?
Yeah, perhaps those are hard to prove, and that's why I remember even it could be second degree. That's what they did against Chauvin, or you could do there's the case I forgot Miss Potter though in Minnesota. That was more of a culpable negligence, involuntary manslaughter. I mean, I think any of these criminal charges are going to be hard, but not impossible. You could try what they did against Chauvin as a secondary murder, saying that it was felony murder. It was in the commission of another felony, which was the aggravated assault. And then when you cause a death, that would be second degree murder. So you could, but man, I'm just telling you, if you expect that this guy's gonna be locked up right away, I can see him being charged at the state level, but this is gonna be a long legal fight, and I don't know where it's gonna end.
And the charging decisions would depend largely on what would be the fault lines that you imagine that there's, for example, we've seen in the video reporting, video analysis by the New York Times, the Washington Post, they analyze what happened before the first shot. And so what are the fault lines that you see, the legal questions that will go into whether or not we see a criminal case out of what happened in Minneapolis?
There's the videos, and they need to get videos from all different angles because the folks on the right are relying on this one grainy video that shows from the front where it appears that the car made contact with the officer up front, and he was the car moved him out of the way, and he started shooting. If you combine that with the video that we're all seeing, the one from the other angle, that you see that he really was not being hit, But if there is that kind of confusion and doubt, it's going to be hard to prosecute that cop and convict him. I think that you need more video. If there's some more video that makes it clear that this car was not a threat to him, was not going at him, the wheels clearly were moving away from him, the car was moving away from him, and that although from one angle it looks like the car, pushed him, moved him out of the way, that may not be true. And if that's not true, then that's a green light for prosecutors to prosecute. And even if it is true, like I said, that would only apply to the first shot, the one through the front, not the side shots.
Right.
That could be different. Now, the defense lawyer for the cop's going to say it's all rapid, all one. It's either one or none. But I think you can separate them because it's clear when she's driving away when those other shots were fired through her side window.
Right. And as a legal matter, each single shot has to have you can't just say if I can shoot one time, I can shoot as many times. Every single one needs to be supported, correct?
Yes, correct.
And
he was shooting to kill there. He was shooting into the car. This was not like a question was an accident, like in the Potter case where she reached for a taser and she didn't realize it was her gun. He reached for his gun and he was shooting. The question is whether he was justified in claiming that he was in reasonable fear of his life. And that's going to be the crux of it. And the federal government's not going to help in the investigation.
Right. And one thing that we still don't know, or at least I'm not aware of any reporting to this effect, we don't know which was the shot that killed her. We don't know if the first shot even hit her and if the shots from the side were the ones that killed her. Did you see any information on that?
I don't have that. And you've identified something that's crucial. That's why we're discussing this early on in this investigation. But the medical examiner, all that stuff's going to be really important. Which of the shots killed her? And then he can try to say, well, it was the first shot. And I mean, this is the kind of stuff that goes on all the time. I had a case similar to that where they were going to argue it was the first shot because the shots after the first one were totally unnecessary. And so we try to get around that issue by charging him with attempted murder. So we didn't have to show which shot was the one who actually killed the innocent victim. It was just the fact that he was shooting at someone who was running away, and that led to a conviction, and the cop is now in prison for 25 years.
You mentioned something almost at the beginning of our conversation, and it's extraordinary. I'm a New York-based reporter, and I entirely missed this story that after Trump's second assassination attempt in Florida, that there was that investigation in the state because they did not trust Merrick Garland, who speedily and ultimately successfully prosecuted Ryan Routh. He was convicted last year, but it leads to my question, and you made the point that was a bogus, that was an unjustified, unwarranted distrust of the federal government, which was doing the right thing at the time. And here we're in an Alice in Wonderland version where the federal government reached a conclusion at the beginning, which is that the victim is a domestic terrorist and that the ICE agent must be protected. And what does this say? The fact that we're talking about, is there a state path forward, say, about where we're at in terms of the federal government and that the state jurisdiction, states' rights as a solution to the place in American history where we find ourselves?
Oh, I think the state can prosecute this case. They can file the charges, they can indict, and then it would be removed to federal court, and then a federal judge would have to make the big decision whether immunity applies. And if immunity does not apply here because of the actions, then it's game on. And Trump can try to pardon. It won't matter. He cannot pardon here. He can try to cajole. Doesn't matter. State officials can move forward. He's trying to shut down the investigation, but the investigation can continue at the state level. I saw a comment that said, why not shoot the tires? Thing is, police are trained not to shoot in the leg, not to shoot tires. If you're going to shoot someone, you're shooting at the main area. You're going to shoot at their body, to try to end the threat against you. And so you're not required to shoot the tires, but at the same time, you're only allowed to shoot in specific, limited circumstances. And I don't think that's here. I mean, I saw the video like you did, and it bothered me. I mean, I reviewed a lot of these videos, and this one bothers me enough that I've said that if I were state attorney, I would take it to the grand jury. And if the grand jury issued a true bill, we would indict. We would move ahead with this case.
It's a deeply disturbing video. I think everyone can agree who's seen this footage and seen it dissected again and again. Dave Aronberg, thank you so much for bringing your expertise, sharing it, and letting everyone who's watching right now, about more than 900 people, a clearer insight into what might be going through state prosecutors' minds right now in the state of Minnesota. For folks who maybe joined a little bit late, missed part of our conversation, take a moment right now to subscribe to All Rise News or Dave Aronberg's Substack. You can see it at the top left of the screen. We'll be posting the full conversation, and along with links to some of the resources that we talked about some of the reports, video analyses, and other information that have emerged today, so you can get an understanding of what folks are, the evidence that has emerged, and the state of play where things stand. Thanks again, Dave.
Thank you, Adam.